before I introduce Chris, I just wanted to take 2 minutes just to remind anybody who doesn't know or who has had a ticket bought by a friend who doesn't know about Avon Needs Trees, what we're about. We are, of course, a new and small charity that's buying land in the Bristol Avon catchment area to plant and rewild, to create new permanent forest. And the purposes, of course, are carbon sequestration, biodiversity, natural flood management, and public amenity space. So I would just explain that. Sorry, why won't that move on? It won't move.
Oh, click.
Click. Come on. Sorry, there we go. Just this map here just explains exactly why we need to do what we're doing. And this is what goaded us into action. It's the very, very little amount of woodland that we have across our whole catchment area and how that puts us all at risk from natural flood management. But obviously we've lost many of those biodiversity benefits with that. And just to say, of course, just as an update where we are, we've just recently bought Hazeland, the 34 acres near Carn in Wiltshire, in our high catchment area. And we're now fundraising for our second piece of land. And the ambition is to go on year after year, buying more pieces of land and like little ants, which we are, Avon Needs Trees, nibbling away at the catchment area and having an impact over that period. And I would be very remiss of me if I didn't mention the crowdfunder that we've got on the go at the moment, which is crowdfunder.co.uk/Avon Needs Trees. It's open for another 2 weeks. So if anybody would like to help us buy that next piece of land at Seend, please do look that up for us. Okay, so let me go on and introduce Chris Goodall, our guest this evening, and very, very many thanks to him for participating. He is very kindly giving his services for free this evening, so that all money goes to Avon Needs Trees, all your ticket sales. I guess many of us will know Chris as he is an economist and an author. Many of us will know his books such as The Switch and his latest book, What Do We Need to Do Now? But particularly possibly through his carbon commentary. And I think that perhaps the best way to explain Chris is to say that as somebody who has been writing about energy issues and climate change for a number of years, I find his carbon commentary a real sort of shaft of optimism, and it's the best source of information on the latest new tech developments at the big scale, costing everything from aviation, clothing, green steel, shipping, food, the whole lot. So if anybody hasn't found Chris's carbon commentary yet, then I would highly recommend it. It's a great fortnightly read, a really good way to keep you up to date. And I would say also, I know Chris has asked me to mention, he stocked up on his own book, What We Need to Do Now, at the beginning of the year, thinking he was going to be doing a pile of talks around the country, and he's got a pile of books left now. If anybody would like to get one of those books, you can just email Chris through his carbon commentary website, send him 10 quid, and he'll put the book in the post to you. I was going to say many other of you will have picked up on Chris's recent Guardian article about a week or so ago, a 9-point plan for net zero in the UK. And I think the strapline there was particularly arresting. Tackling climate change is neither difficult nor expensive and can help boost the economy. So I guess that's what we're going to hear about tonight. And so I'd very much like to welcome Chris, and over to you to screen share, Chris.
Thank you very much indeed, Nikki. It's a great privilege to be able to talk tonight. Always this terrible moment here where I try to share things and hope it comes up. Can you see me, Nikki? Can you see the presentation? Yes. Good, okay, that's fantastic. Good. Thank you, Nikki, for that introduction. And it's a real privilege to be talking to a group that is so interested in the redevelopment of our underforested land. There's much that we can all do, and I'm looking forward very much to coming to see one of your developments as soon as I can. It's exactly what needs to happen in my part of the world, which is Oxfordshire, which similarly is virtually denuded of trees. This talk is about a book that I published just as the lockdown was happening. It puts in place a plan, an outline plan, for how the UK might move from its current position to being completely decarbonised at some stage in the not too distant future. 2050 is probably too late. It's going to take us decades, but nevertheless, we can perhaps aim for much earlier than 2050. And I'll be trying to suggest ways in which that could become possible. Now, this book, let me just make sure I can swing between slides. Yes. The book had two objectives when I wrote it. The first was to identify a route to net zero. That is to say, a point at which the UK has no net emissions, that any remaining emissions from greenhouse gas or from methane in agriculture are offset by something like woodlands, growing woodlands, which absorb carbon from the atmosphere. So that was the first ambition. But the second one, which is equally important in my opinion, in fact, the first cannot be achieved without the second, is to make sure that the process and the outcome of this move to net zero is positive for the people who are in the bottom half of the income distribution. It is no good assuming that we can do net carbon if the consequence of it is going to be further difficulties, economic difficulties, social difficulties across our country. This has to be something which brings the UK together, creates a more equal society. But throughout this book, I'm trying to show that decarbonisation is possible, even in the very difficult sectors, and almost certainly highly advantageous to a modern economy, whether it be the UK or indeed anywhere else in the world. What we've done in Britain so far in the last 20 years of active involvement, active engagement on climate change has been to pretty effectively decarbonise the electricity system. We've done well, let's face it. We've cut emissions by roughly 75% from electricity generation. We've moved almost completely away from coal. We've developed renewables both on land and in the North Sea. We're the world leader in offshore wind. This is good, but we've got a vast number of other challenges to face, none of which have actually been looked at very seriously so far. Excuse me, I need to go back to work out how to do this on me.
Just press your
none of these. Yes, I think we've got there. Yes, I'm sorry there, Dorian. None of this has been looked at. But each of these sectors is showing signs of some fall, but mostly we still have these activities to deal with. That ranges from agriculture, heavy industry, steel making, aviation, the manufacture of cement, the cutting of emissions from our very poorly insulated houses. The list goes on. None of these have really seriously been looked at. And in the book, I try to identify a route by which we might get emissions from those areas down and down rapidly. Sorry. This won't happen again, don't worry. Right. Let's have a look then at what happened to total greenhouse gases, the position we're in today and how far we've got to go to get to net zero. 1990, the year of the Kyoto Accord, total emissions, including CO2, but all the other greenhouse gases which we have to worry about, such as methane and nitrous oxide, accounted for roughly 800 million tonnes a year of emissions from the UK. This is not counting the things we're buying from abroad, which have become, of course, increasingly important in the last 30 years. During the period since 1990, net emissions have fallen. They've fallen quite sharply, by about 25% or even more, both for non-CO2 and for CO2 itself. So some evidence that we're moving in the right direction. But the majority of the emissions reduction has come from the cutting of CO2 emissions from power stations, particularly coal-fired power stations. Much of the rest of our emissions portfolio has not been as successful. But today, this year, 2020, we'll see emissions from power stations of the order of 50 or 60 million tonnes, or less than 10% of our total greenhouse, or about 10% of our total greenhouse gas emissions. So we cracked that problem, other ones remain. And here's an example, here's an illustration of that. You can see at the bottom, the emissions from power stations, the rest of it is the rest of the sectors. Now, What is the UK going to do first? I'm now moving into sectors. I'm now going to talk about electricity first, and particularly how we deal with the fact that renewables are not predictable, they are not constant. Wind and solar energy cannot be relied on, and that point is usually used to justify a continuation with either fossil fuels or to go with nuclear power stations. I personally have no ideological belief that nuclear power stations are wrong, wicked, or anything like that, or indeed particularly dangerous. But the fact is that they're vastly expensive today, and so probably the UK is going to push on wind and solar, particularly offshore wind, rather than nuclear. That leaves us with a problem. Wind drops, the sun doesn't shine, we have to make up the rest of the electricity demand that comes in. Yes, we're getting better and better at shifting electricity demand to when we've got lots of it available, but that's nowhere near enough. Batteries are not going to be enough either. We simply won't have enough capacity. The amounts would be enormous, and we would only use them once or twice a year in many examples. So what we decided to do as a society, and I question this decision in my book, is to say we're going to use gas-fired power stations as the complement to wind and solar. And here's an illustration from the end of August how this works. At some portions of these 3 or 4, this week-long period, we had enormous amounts of wind, and in some periods we had virtually none. And as a result, we were reliant upon gas to make up the difference. There's a bit of solar, but not very much in this period. Mostly it was the variation in wind, and wind varied enormously in this period. On the 24th of August at 9 o'clock in the evening, wind was just 5% of total electricity demand, and gas performed over half of our electricity need. A couple of days later, less than 48 hours later, wind was 61%. I think that was the record at the time, probably still is the record for the total share of wind in our electricity production. And gas fell to 19%. We've also got imports, we've got nuclear power stations, we've got biomass generation, but these were the 2 most important sources. And that's what the government wants us to do. And it wants us to decarbonise the UK, continue to decarbonise the UK's electricity system by using gas-fired power stations, plus carbon capture and storage, capturing the flue gas and then taking the carbon dioxide out of it and sticking it somewhere, probably in a depleted North Sea oil well, and using it and keeping it there forever. Probably more expensive, certainly more expensive today than offshore wind. Not certain of the feasibility of it. It's proved difficult to do elsewhere in the world. We'll see whether it could work here. My plan is very different. It says, actually, we can get rid of most of the problem of intermittency, almost all of the problem of intermittency, if we have so much renewable capacity that very rarely does it not meet electricity demand. So if we multiply the amount of renewable capacity that we have by 20-fold, compared to what we have at the moment, this covers electricity needs almost all of the time. I've modeled this. Of course, it varies year by year, but we can be pretty confident that almost all the time we'll have enough electricity just with renewables, even after we've added to electricity demand by buying electric vehicles and by switching to heat pumps for domestic heating. Now, what do we do with the surplus? Because most of the time we're going to have huge surpluses. Well, my proposal is to store it in the form of hydrogen. Why hydrogen? Well, we'll talk about that in a minute, but I wanted to just illustrate what we're going to do with we're going to need a lot of electricity. We're going to need about 1/3 more electricity than we have at the moment if we completely move to electric transport, which is almost certainly a possibility. Even heavy road vehicles can be switched to electricity. Batteries are becoming cheaper. Manufacturers are diving into this market as fast as they can, right across the world. On the left, we've got the first car, which can say pretty roughly that it's the same price as the equivalent. It's the new Volkswagen ID.3, which is roughly the same as a Volkswagen Golf, and it's roughly, slightly more expensive, it's roughly the same price, certainly taking into account the fact that electricity is cheaper than petrol. Over the course of its life, it's going to be significantly cheaper. A good-looking, long-range car, which can do 200, 250 miles on a good day. That means a warm day. On the other side, a van, which is capable of carrying large amounts of goods on motorways or elsewhere. These things can all be switched. We can also switch a lot of domestic heating to heat pumps. Instead of using gas-fired heating, central heating boilers, we can use something like this, an air source heat pump sitting on the outside of the house, which exchanges heat, pumps heat into the air, pumps cold air out back into the outside environment. Works very well in a lot of other countries. Our houses aren't particularly well insulated by European standards. We have about 3 times the heat loss, for example, of the same size of German house in the same climatic conditions. And that makes heat pumps much more difficult to implement, but we can move a long way towards electrification of heat. So I said we're going to multiply, my plan is to multiply overall renewables by about 20-fold. My suggestion is that means about 250 gigawatts. Don't worry too much about the unit. We've got about 10 gigawatts now, so that's a 25 times multiple. Onshore wind, a smaller multiple, and solar, a large multiple as well. And that will have some implications for land use. That's roughly the areas that would be used by these renewable sources. It will use the offshore wind. It's a large area. It uses roughly, my plan, roughly 1/3 of the shallow water around the UK, inside the UK's exclusive economic zone, the area where we have the right to do that. Solar, a relatively small fraction of total UK land area, and of course it can be shared with other things such as sheep farming. Offshore wind, a larger area, but once again, it actually only occupies a small amount of space on the ground. So I think this is perfectly feasible. And if we don't like it being onshore, we can simply put more offshore wind and make that available to us. So what are we going to do with the surplus that's generated by having so much electricity available to us? I said we're going to move it into hydrogen in my plan. And we use hydrogen particularly for 4 different things. We can store it and then put it back into a fuel cell to turn it back into electricity on those times when we don't have enough. We can use hydrogen to replace natural gas for central heating in those buildings which cannot be switched to heat pumps. Today, it must be stressed, that would be much more expensive than natural gas, so it's not an easy necessarily solution. It requires us to massively improve the insulation of our houses, and that's one of the sections of the book. We use hydrogen also to replace fossil fuels in many industrial processes, such as, for example, steel making, where instead of using coal, we can switch entirely to hydrogen. That's a relatively easy transition, which steelmakers around the world are now, if not enthusiastically, at least actively moving towards. And lastly, we can use hydrogen as the key ingredient for synthetic fuels, fuels which can mimic fossil fuels such as oil. We may store the energy in the form of ammonia, which can be used as a fuel source, or indeed as a direct substitute for petrol, using petrol, making hydrogen into something like petrol. And we'll talk a bit about that in a minute as well. Now, that requires, to get electricity into hydrogen, requires us to use something called an electrolyzer. You probably played with one of these at school when you put a cathode and anode into from the battery into water, and you watch hydrogen coming off at one cathode at one and oxygen at the other. And this is what they look like on a slightly larger scale. This is a relatively small electrolyzer, 1 megawatt, sitting in a warehouse in Orkney, off the north coast of Scotland, where it's used to generate hydrogen from surplus wind. And my goodness, Orkney has a lot of surplus wind even today. So that's roughly what they look like, and they can be made in vastly greater scale than this. The manufacturer ITM Power, which operates out of Sheffield, is building a factory to make 1,000 of these every year, 1 whole gigawatt of power. And around the world, there is a massive expansion going on in electrolyzer use and electrolyzer building. It's a sector that's developing far faster than anybody expected, far faster, for example, than solar or wind energy did in the past. So hydrogen is becoming possible to generate in large quantities. As I mentioned, the Orkney does this, and Orkney is in many ways a great pilot project for the world's attempt to move into a renewables plus hydrogen energy economy. Roughly 50% of all the wind energy that's collected from turbines on Orkney is lost because there's no need for it, and there's a very poor connection back to the Scottish mainland. And on the islands of Orkney, the surplus power is increasingly being used for the manufacture of hydrogen, for the conversion back through fuel cells into electricity at the port on the mainland island, for, in one case, powering the heating system for a school on one of the islands, for providing the fuel for fuel cell powered vehicles, electric vehicles that store hydrogen and turn that hydrogen into electricity. So that's the best example worldwide of what I'm trying to propose in the book. That is to say, the building of a renewables economy where we have too many renewables, too much capacity to make electricity, and where the surplus is used to generate hydrogen. But it's also happening at various other places around Britain and around Europe. This particular project hasn't come into being yet, but it's been announced and will happen. The offshore wind developer Ørsted, the single most important offshore wind developer in the world, and an incredibly vital part of what the UK is trying to do in the North Sea, is going to take some of the output from one of its next wind farms in the North Sea and put it into an electrolyzer to be provided by ITM Power, the Sheffield company. And there, the hydrogen that's been generated there will go into a local oil refinery. Oil refineries need hydrogen in order to work. The world makes 70 million tons of hydrogen principally for this purpose, for making it possible to make petrol and other fuels out of crude oil. So this isn't the ideal end point for our energy transition, because we hope oil refineries will cease to exist. But this is a way of showing that hydrogen generated from offshore wind can be a competitive way of producing, of supplying oil refineries around the world.
Chris,
So
can I just exercise my right to interruption? And I just think it's so fascinating. You know, we all, and I hope most people are understanding the crucial role that hydrogen has here in incentivizing new renewables and being such a safe and flexible storage system. But what I want to know is, so the question is, this is so vital to this transition. Does our government get it? Do most governments get it? At the moment, it seems very much led by the private sector. How much support is getting from our government and from others?
Well, this government has had other things on its mind over the last year, and it hasn't actually announced very much. But governments around Europe are piling billions into this. Germany has said it will put 9 billion euros into the creation of a hydrogen sector. France comes in a little lower at 7 billion, and Spain has just announced 10.5 billion. So these countries are saying hydrogen is absolutely at the center of the energy transition. And we need, as governments, to push this hard, because it won't happen at the moment. Hydrogen is still too expensive when made from renewables, when compared to making it from natural gas, which is the principal way it's made at the moment. It's possibly 2 to 3 times more expensive at the moment. And what the world needs is governments, principally, to push this so hard that costs come down. The cost of hydrogen in the end is principally related to the cost of the renewable electricity that goes into making it. We are seeing continued declines in the price of electricity. Other places around the world are also moving as fast as they can. Australia particularly sees this as a long-term opportunity to replace the coal exports, which it's so reliant upon at the moment. It's also got some of the best solar resources in the world, often combined with wind resources. Parts of Western Australia, for example, have such wind and solar that they can be making hydrogen every day and all day, pretty much. The Dutch government, which is this illustration here, is granted the latest license to develop an offshore wind farm off North Holland there, on the basis that part of the output there would also be used to supply hydrogen to a wind farm, to an oil refinery. So the answer to your question is, Nikki, we haven't done yet much, although there is talk of a major announcement on this within the next month or so. But we need to follow it. In order to be an effective participant in this industry, we will need to follow almost all other Northern European countries into identifying this as a sector which needs to be developed and needs to be developed quickly if we're going to make the energy transition happen.
Okay. Can I ask
Now,
a supplementary, Chris, or
no, please, Nikki, let's keep this one question.
just because in recent years, what it's felt like is the government is supporting hydrogen in as much as it supports the gas industry, because they want to see that the cracking of methane to turn it into hydrogen rather than the use of clean renewables. And I just wonder, again, just to press you on this very briefly, I suspect that possibly is the case for the Australian government as well. Are we seeing governments moving towards the idea that hydrogen has to come from a clean source, not from gas? Yes.
The German government, which is, I think, is the intellectual leader in this, is saying, yeah, we have decided that the hydrogen that we're going to make will come from a green source. Okay. So the alternative is to make hydrogen, continue to make hydrogen from natural gas, but collect the CO2 and store that CO2. So that's what's called that's called blue hydrogen. Forgive me for getting mixed up there. And that is theoretically carbon neutral, so it could help us in our transition. But the German government has said, actually, no, this is in some ways a dead end. We want to build the green hydrogen sector as fast as we can, get the electrolyzers down in cost, get the offshore wind or wherever it is, the solar farms, tied into electrolyzers as the primary means of getting hydrogen. And my belief is that that's the way the world will move. We're different in this country, partly because we think that carbon capture and storage is economically and socially viable. That is to say, we can capture the CO2 from a power station or from hydrogen manufacturer or whatever, put it into the ground safely forever. That is completely politically impossible across most of the rest of Europe, including principally Germany. And frankly, if it doesn't happen in Germany, it's probably not going to happen anywhere. Norway and Britain are the only countries in the world where carbon capture and storage is being really deeply discussed. I believe it's probably a dead end. I believe we shouldn't be pushing this in this direction. It's too expensive. Storage capacity is pretty large, but not unlimited inside our, for example, depleted oil fields in the North Sea. I think probably we'd be better use those for storing hydrogen, in my personal opinion. But mostly we'll be storing hydrogen in salt caverns, which we already do in this country for industrial purposes. And we have perfectly adequate capacity to store enough hydrogen to last for months of low wind speeds. Does that answer the question, Nikki, or was that something else come up?
Yes, it does. I have to say, we've had one question come up in the chat box about, if you could just briefly address this one on the safety of hydrogen. That's something that comes up quite often. Is it safe to store? Is it safe to use as a vehicle, transport fuel, and so on?
Well, we're storing a lot of hydrogen under the ground already in the UK. There are, I think, 3 salt caverns in which hydrogen is being stored prior to being used in oil refineries or fertilizer plants. So no problem so far. We are all scarred by the photographs of the Hindenburg, but remember, it wasn't the hydrogen that was burning there. It was the dope on the coating on the fabric, which provided the structure of the Hindenburg. Hydrogen is probably, there's going to be someone in the audience who's going to disagree with us fiercely, probably safer than natural gas inside properly run gas networks because it dissipates so fast. Natural gas, if it leaks at the moment, sticks around, you can smell it, it's there, it doesn't go. If you had the same leak from hydrogen, that would disappear upwards very quickly indeed because it's such a light gas and will just disappear. Yes, of course, there are circumstances, but hydrogen is much less flammable than we think it is. Not something, I'm not trying to minimize this, it's clearly a safety issue, but we have hydrogen pipelines already, we have hydrogen storage already, we use hydrogen in a wide variety of circumstances. And it's not necessarily the right advert for hydrogen, but until the mid-60s, we had a gas system using town gas, which was about 50% hydrogen. Town gas was about 50% hydrogen and 50% carbon monoxide. So we're used to coping with it. And I think we should be able to do so in the future. I'm not arguing for complacency, but I'm suggesting that it is possible to live with hydrogen and do so safely. So let me push on a bit, conscious that the time's going. I wanted to talk very briefly about energy islands, because I think this is going to be vital to our decarbonisation. This is man-made islands in the centre of the North Sea or the Baltic, which are connected to large numbers of wind turbines and which provide a hub from which electricity can flow from one country to another. So imagine this island being shown here, which is a mock-up produced by the Dutch grid operator, TenneT, which is the big enthusiast for this idea. That island could be in the middle of the North Sea and could link Britain with Norway, Denmark, Netherlands, and Germany, for example, to provide an interconnector system which would allow temporary surpluses in one country to be pushed effectively, cost effectively to others. The first of these wind islands is already in progress. It's an existing, actually not man-made island called Bornholm in the Danish portion of the Baltic. And from there, electricity will flow to Germany and to Poland. So it's just an example of the way that European cooperation can make the transition to a renewables plus hydrogen system much faster. And one plea, of course, that we should be making to the government is please don't use the 31st of December as an excuse to cut us off from the rest of the European electricity system. It's absolutely vital to cost-effective and rapid decarbonisation. Now, a last point here, I try and deal with it a little bit more extensively in the book. Last point on energy, which is I believe that there is a case, a very strong case, for the municipalisation of all the major utilities services in the UK, to make them more efficient, more responsive to local needs, and to make local trading of energy, buying and selling. I produce my solar on the roof, you want to buy it, you buy it from me down the road. This happens most effectively, or it's going furthest in Germany, where most people are supplied by the local electricity company, giving them a variety of services, not just electricity, but water, broadband, mobile phone, and gas. The biggest of these is the Munich city utility, profitable, employs 6,000 people, developing its own renewable energy assets. Now, I realize that the experience of quasi-municipal electricity utilities, gas utilities in the UK, such as Bristol Energy and Robin Hood in Nottingham, has not been entirely satisfactory. It hasn't been easy. But that's partly because these utilities are restricted to very small portions of the value added. They can't go around managing, for example, the local network. All this is done in this country by privatized companies, often owned by private equity abroad, which haven't provided much of a service. And I argue in the book for an extensive municipalization, remunicipalization of services, because this is the way it used to be done in the UK before we set up regional electricity companies. Talked a bit about hydrogen safety. This is the Worcester-Bosch prototype hydrogen/natural gas central heating boiler. I just wanted to prove to such a thing existed. It can be switched from hydrogen to natural gas. It won't be much more expensive than an existing natural gas boiler. Worcester-Bosch says less than 10% more expensive. The crucial thing here is making sure, for example, that the flame is visible, because hydrogen burns almost invisibly. It also burns more at a higher temperature than natural gas. So there are lots of things to think about, but Worcester-Bosch is confident that a hydrogen central heating boiler is perfectly feasible and can be rapidly developed should the UK decide to move down this route. The question is, how quickly can we make hydrogen competitive, roughly competitive with natural gas? We can also use hydrogen for the making of fertilizer, which is the second most important use of hydrogen. Now, here's an example of what's going on, although we've seen it in the last few weeks, a much larger case where the Spanish utility Iberdrola has built a solar farm next to a fertilizer plant. The solar farm will make hydrogen, and the hydrogen will be fed into the fertilizer plant to replace natural gas as the source of the hydrogen for the making of fertilizer, which is principally composed of ammonia, which, as you know, is nitrogen and hydrogen. So this is in Pilbara, the Yara, the biggest, I think, fertilizer manufacturer. This is in Pilbara, which is in Western Australia. It's one of the places with magnificent sun and very high winds as well. So the greatest, possibly the cheapest place to make hydrogen in the world, and that's where Yara is going to push it. We're also going to be able to use hydrogen to make steel. The most advanced manufacturer in the world in this area is the Swedish company called SSAB, and this is in northern Sweden. This is using hydrogen instead of coal to reduce iron ore to iron. It is at the moment more expensive than making steel from coal, but SSAB is confident within a few years and a reasonable price of carbon, we'll talk a bit about that later, it can get the price of hydrogen made steel down to the same as steel made using very dirty coal, very large quantities of coal. Steel is responsible for something like 6% of world emissions, and we need to decarbonize this rapidly. But the good thing is that most large European manufacturers have all got their plans at least in place to begin the process of making steel from hydrogen. Varying states, but SSAB there will be doing commercial development of steel by 2024 for those people who wish to buy zero carbon steel. So I said right at the beginning that we're also going to be using hydrogen to make synthetic fuels. We can make ammonia. We can use ammonia as a fuel from hydrogen. That's a simple process. Or we can take CO2 from the air and combine the carbon in that with hydrogen to make the fuels that we need for things like aviation or for plastics. Of course, we want to minimize the amount of aviation we need. We want to minimize the amount of plastics, but this is the route to do it. We need to capture the CO2 from the air in order to achieve, to make a hydrocarbon, something mixed of hydrogen and carbon. That is a difficult process. It hasn't happened in very large quantities yet, but this is an example of a machine that takes carbon directly out of the air. In this case, you can see 18 fans on the roof of a waste disposal plant in Switzerland, near Zurich. The carbon dioxide is pooled across a chemical. The chemical captures the carbon dioxide, and then it's taken away, the chemical, and heated, and the carbon dioxide is driven off and put into pipes, and it's fed into the enormous greenhouse you can see in the back of the picture. CO2 helps plants grow, so this is an example of CO2 capture and its use in a productive environment. We can also use it, as I said, though, for making hydrocarbons, such as aviation fuel. And this is an example of where it's happening in Norway on a much larger scale. This is a plant that will be built over the next few years, which combines an electrolyzer using renewable electricity, a process for turning hydrogen and carbon into fuel for aviation, and also a place where carbon is captured. So this will be the first integrated plant for the manufacture of a zero carbon aviation fuel. At the moment, as I keep on saying, this would be more expensive. But as countries get more strict about particularly things like aviation, there's every expectation this will become competitive with other forms of fuel. And Norway is already talking about making all internal flights carbon-free. It's imposed a small requirement. I think it's 5% at the moment of all aviation fuel needs to be carbon-free. And this is what's driven this company to develop this. There won't be CO2 capture here from the air. It will actually be captured from the cement plant that you can see on the left of the picture. But in future developments in Norway, CO2 will be captured directly from the air. That leaves us with cement as the really difficult issue, the really difficult decarbonisation. It's probably necessary for us to do carbon capture and storage for cement, but possibly only for cement. It's the most difficult thing to decarbonise. Right, so I've moved there from energy to the next most important sector, which is agriculture. very uncomfortable to talk about this, but we do desperately need to change the agricultural system, the things that we eat, the things that we grow, if we're going to get to net zero, because very roughly, agriculture around the world is responsible for approximately a quarter of our global emissions. Of that, by far the most important area is livestock. And of that livestock, cattle are the single most important factor, with approximately 10% of global emissions. That probably means that a diet that's composed of as much beef as at the moment is incompatible globally with a stable climate. Now, we can move down the road towards beef substitutes made from plant, or we can decide to move to a plant-based agriculture system. I don't know, it's up to society to choose how we move, but I think it's very difficult to see how climate stability can be reconciled with continued large-scale production of beef as an important food source for humanity. Already in most developed countries, we're seeing falling demand for beef, but it's still too large. It's still 10% of global emissions, and we need to do something about that. One of the other areas we can work on, however, in agriculture is by moving towards what's called vertical agriculture, indoor vertical agriculture, where plants are grown in, under LED light with heat or cooling required. Now, this principally is only leafy greens at the moment and some berries, that is to say lettuce, salads, herbs, and things like strawberries. But we can move it more extensively, and the Bristol company Let Us Grow, which many of you will have heard of, is one of the leaders in this field, and be very interesting to see what they can do. They've just, I see, announced a containerized system for indoor growing. That is to say, everything can be put in a shipping container. You walk in there, it's growing, and then you can take it out and harvest it. There's some much larger scale on the right-hand side, but it can also be done in the left-hand advertisement and left-hand photograph in the middle of a supermarket. And we're seeing increasing numbers of those around Europe. And I think Marks and Spencer's is going to introduce them into the UK fairly soon. This is made by a German company called Infarm. But more important than that is the decarbonisation of grain-based agriculture. That's the most important source of our calories. And we can't decarbonise without getting hold of the problems caused by intensive monoculture of wheat and barley, particularly in the UK. Why can't we deal with it? Because that uses a lot of fertilizer. Fertilizer breaks down into a greenhouse gas, nitrous oxide. It also has a lot of emissions during the manufacturing process. Less so if we decarbonize the manufacturing process, but we still have got a problem here. And in the book, I talk about a small-scale farmer called John Letts, who says that the answer, and I think this is very plausible, I'm really surprised by this, but I think it has much more plausibility than I expected, is to move back to essentially medieval agriculture. What he found was that if you use very old varieties of grains, not just wheat or barley, but a variety of things like spelt or einkorn or whatever, and grow them with varieties which hadn't been bred to be short, you get a grain mixture that's highly resistant to pests, therefore doesn't need pesticides, dominates weeds because it grows to 2 meters high approximately, as you can see on the left, and also doesn't need much irrigation because big plants, tall plants, tend to have much deeper roots, and therefore they can cope with the increasing threat of drought in English summers, particularly Eastern England summers. So what I think John Letts is pushing for is an intelligent return to what you might almost term medieval agriculture, the kind of agriculture you might see in a Bruegel painting. But his belief, and it's got a lot of data now to back it up, that average yields per hectare over the course of a decade can be as high as our existing intense forms of agriculture with minimal environmental damage. That's something that really does need deep investigation. I talked a bit in the beginning about the absolutely critical need to minimize heat loss from British housing, which runs at levels which are pretty much the highest in Europe. in terms of heat loss per square meter, cubic meter of housing. This is one illustration of the way we might cope with the problem. This is a development of social housing in Nottingham. It was a row of 8 houses that were originally owned by the city. 2 of them were bought, 6 remained, and those 6 are the ones that have been converted into pretty close to carbon neutral housing systems. They do need some heating, but mostly they get it from a ground source heat pump and from the solar panels on their roof. The crucial thing here is that this renovation, this deep refurbishment, was done in the space of 3 weeks. That is to say, the houses, the people who lived in those houses didn't have to move out, and with minimum disruption. Not perfect, but this was done very quickly indeed, and it could done so because everything there was manufactured in a factory, brought to the site and pinned to the side of the house. Everybody here lives here, extremely happy with what's going on. The 2 privately owned houses want to convert as well. This was expensive. It's about, I think, over £100,000 per house to do this. But the developer that pushing this, Energy Strong, a not-for-profit entity in the Netherlands, is now getting Netherlands housing down to around €40,000, at which point it becomes competitive and makes it possible to, as I say, almost completely decarbonize. And that's roughly what we're going to do. And if we're going to oblige people to use hydrogen boilers, which hydrogen is more expensive than natural gas, we can't do decarbonization unless we make it financially possible to do so. But it's not just new housing and old housing. We also need to make new housing to the highest possible standards. And we're seeing local authorities such as York, which announced something last week, to move at least to passive housing, that is to say, no net emissions in use, but beyond that, so that the house, the construction of the house, also has no net emissions. That means principally using long-term wood. So the wood has captured carbon, it's put into the house and stored. So that over the course of the lifetime of these houses, and this is a development planned in South Wales, there's net carbon stored by the process. The world, particularly the UK, with its particular problems of very old, very badly insulated houses, 25% of our houses were built before the First World War. That's the largest number in the world. We need to make particular efforts in this direction. And until we do so, we ain't going to get anywhere close to net zero. Housing, roughly 20% of total emissions in the UK. We also, in my opinion, need to move to zero carbon transportation. Yes, we can buy electric cars, but that doesn't completely solve the problem. Cars take energy to produce, they take resources to produce. We need to move our cities towards being pedestrian and cycle-centric, and in many of our cases, we can go a very long way towards that. It's politically difficult to do so. There's no question about it. In the town I come from, Oxford, the closure of one street is proving highly controversial. But the point I try to make is that there's no town or city in the world that I have ever seen where once a decision has been made successfully to implement better pedestrianisation, properly enhanced cycling, no city has moved back from that position. An early example of the importance, a city that gave enormous importance to cycling is Utrecht in the Netherlands. It's well known. It has about 35,000 parking spaces around the central station, in a town of around 300,000 people, by the way. Over 50% of all trips are either walking or cycling in the Netherlands, don't even use, in Utrecht, don't even use public transport. And importantly, Utrecht has calculated that the net benefit to the city arising from lower demands on its health services, from fitter, healthier people with less pollution, has more than covered the cost of the extensive development, 50 million euros a year at some points, of that cycling network. An example on the right of a city that's moved to a very large scale, essentially car-free city centre, one of the early pioneers in this, and we're seeing this increasingly around the world. The point is that you go to places like that, talk to the mayor, and the mayor says, nobody would ever dream of going back. It's improved local commerce, pollution levels are higher, people want to live in the city centre again. There's no disadvantage, there's no systematic disadvantage from this. However, I would say, of course, it is politically difficult to do this in the UK. We need to decarbonize clothing. One of the most important sectors, one of the most difficult sectors to decarbonize, and possibly the most wasteful of all our resources. We buy something, we wear it 100 times typically, and then we throw it away, and less than 1% of all clothing is recycled. IKEA has just announced that it will be taking furniture back for recycling. H&M is saying the same thing about some of its clothing products in Sweden. This is an example of a fabric that minimizes the environmental disadvantages of clothing. It's called Tencel. It's made from viscose, which will come from waste wood, and has a long life and can be much more effectively recycled than, for example, cotton. Right, move to something much closer to home. I think the UK needs a massive investment in reforestation. Not crude reforestation, square mile after square mile of Sitka spruce, but what you're trying to do in Avon Needs Trees is a perfect example of this. A mixture of rewilding, some planting, some cases where you just let it grow, the maintenance of existing old forests, the mixture of open areas with closed areas, which is absolutely vital to wildlife. The UK has the least woodland of any large country in Europe. It's about 13% across the whole of the UK. It's much less in England. And that compares with over 30% in every other large country in Europe, including 30 to 35% in France, Spain, Germany, and Italy, our nearest sort of direct comparators here. We decided to grow sheep instead. I think this was a mistake by our ancestors 500 years ago, and we ought to go back to the patterns of land use that we see in Northern Europe. Why? Because woodland is not only beneficial potentially to flood prevention, it's better for wildlife growth, biodiversity, but also it captures carbon. In the UK, we grow a lot of sheep, and it's an important export, although I suspect it will be heavily curtailed on the 31st of December of this year. We make about 3.3 million tonnes of sheep meat a year, and we use roughly 20% of UK land area to do that. If we did the same thing, if we turned that into woodland, we would capture roughly 40 million tonnes of CO2, or roughly 10% of our total CO2 emissions. If we're going to move to net zero quickly, we need rapid reforestation across the UK, and we have almost perfect circumstances to do that. Often very poor quality pasture, but which will grow trees quite rapidly, and where there's enough rainfall to make sure the trees prosper through their early years. Another benefit is that it will save the UK money. It costs around £1 billion a year to subsidise UK sheep farming at the moment. And if we switched, we are the second most important importer of wood products in the world at £8 billion. That's more than any other country in the world apart from China. And we could use much of that woodland to provide some of our wood products. I'm not arguing for just mile after mile of intensive woodland which only grows spruce in order to turn it into wood pellets. I hope it can be more sophisticated than that. But this is a scale, an indication of the sort of scale that reforestation might have in terms of the net benefits to the economy. We are also going to have to capture carbon. We're going to have to capture carbon and stick it underneath the ground. We can do so using the technology which I showed from the Zurich plant, which was attached to the greenhouse. The best place to stick CO2, probably for long-term storage, is in basalt. We tend to be obsessed with using North Sea oil fields, old North Sea oil fields, but around the rest of the world where this is being contemplated, and this is a photograph of a geothermal plant in Iceland, re-injecting CO2 into basalt, which absorbs CO2 and turns itself into a different rock, may be the right way forward. So in the book, I argue that we've got to pursue all of these things, including some forms of carbon capture. Other forms of geoengineering, as it might be called, that we might be thinking about, but which are highly uncomfortable, but I think we do need as a society to explore the way in which we might get to zero carbon using geoengineering, are, for example, on the right-hand side, the manufacture of biochar. Wood that's cut down, for example, from woodlands that were being harvested, can be pyrolyzed, that is to say, heated to a very high temperature so that it gives off gases. What's left is almost pure carbon, and that can be put into the soil, and in the right circumstances, properly done, it's not a trivial task, massively improves the fertility of poor soils. That works best probably in tropical countries, but it would also work well here. On the right-hand side, a method of geoengineering, which is to introduce low-level cloud over oceans to stop some of the sun getting through. This is the kind of thing we need to be thinking about, in my opinion, now, simply because the climate crisis is moving so fast towards destroying large parts of human civilization. It's not there yet, but we're already seeing the huge impacts of climate change, particularly in countries where it's becoming almost impossible to live because of summer temperatures. Now, I talked right at the beginning, this is the last slide but one, of the second major objective of the book, which was to show how all these changes could make a better, healthier society. Number one, I think, is by improving the insulation standards of our homes. Large numbers of people suffer throughout the winter. They suffer in terms of income, they suffer in terms of health by having very poor quality housing, which allows in too much cold. We need to do this street by street, city by city, making these improvements. That will involve some changes to the outside of our houses. And I think we as a society ought to be debating that. Those Victorian houses that we think are quite pretty, quite beautiful, make our cities look good, they are terrible from the point of view of carbon savings. If we're not going to impose hydrogen heating on people, we do need to think about how best to get much better insulated homes. We need to improve public transport. Other places around Europe are moving to free public transport. We probably can't do that because of the political ideology in this country, but we need to think about that, particularly by banning cars from large portions of our city centres to make it more attractive to use public transport. The moves that I suggest in the book will lower pollution, and that includes noise pollution, which I think is an under-recognised portion of the pollution which affects us. I believe that we can generate much better food. We're moving away from an industrial food system towards something which is much more responsive to our natural needs. The process, the proposals in the book obviously produce a very large number, perhaps about 1 million for at least a 10-year period of good quality jobs in renewables. My goodness, we are going to need those jobs over the next few years as we try and recover from the economic depression that we're just about to enter into. Particularly, we're going to get good jobs in forestry and wood products. That is to say, we're giving farmers that make sheep and perhaps even beef products at the moment to move towards forestry and wood products. Now, it's an enormous transition. It's extremely unpopular, very difficult to discuss, and it needs extensive national conversation about how we give farmers a good, effective income and a good life from moving away from animal cultivation on poor quality land. Lots of places around the world show just how effective this can be. For example, places like South Tyrol, where wood is far more important than the growing of sheep or cattle. We need to build a circular economy. That's much talked about, but one of the most important things we need to do is to move towards recycling, full recycling of clothes. Not just selling secondhand through the Oxfam shop, but taking apart, designing our clothes so they can be easily taken apart and rebuilt. And we're beginning to see just the beginnings of movements there from the big clothing manufacturers and retailers around the world to this particularly important thing. But we also need, of course, to recycle the electronic products, which are once again barely recycled at all at the moment. And I've argued in the book, as I mentioned, for local control over energy and for other utilities to advance the speed of the transition and to make sure that things are not blocked by the power of international capital over our existing utility services. Lastly, I haven't talked in this session about the reasons why I think a carbon tax is important. There's only one thing that economists around the world are united on, and that is the world needs a carbon tax. It's unpopular, it's difficult to design, but it's the way in which we incentivize large companies to move away from pollution creating activities to where it makes financial sense to move towards a zero carbon future. So those are the benefits to our societies. I want the dividend.
Hello, Chris. Have we lost you suddenly? Chris, can you hear us? Oh, no. Just when we've got a pile of questions to ask. I guess we'll give him a couple of minutes, see if he reconnects.
Can you call him on the mobile?
Yep, let's give that a go. He's actually in Wales. He's not on a standard connection. Dory, can you just yeah, we'll just give him a ring. Sorry about that. He's we've had a good connection so far. I guess as we speak to right, okay. Well, we'll deal with some of the questions, I guess, as we well, we'll accumulate some of the questions while we wait. Right, Chris's phone's gone straight to voicemail, so can he reconnect easily?
I mean, he's got the link.
He's got the link, so okay, we'll give him a couple of minutes. I mean, there's some interesting discussion there. I guess, I mean, some of the things that we've also had quite a few questions in advance. I think some of the questions that I want to ask Chris about that have come from you are primarily about the optimism around some of the government figures that he's using right at the beginning. As some of you have pointed out, I think he did himself say that those figures don't include imports, which of course is huge for our country. But there are various other things, of course, that aren't included in the government figures, like our use of biomass, our imported renewable or our imported electricity from countries that are using much lower proportions of renewables than we are, and of course the full life cycle of gas and things like that. So there's a lot of fudging in those figures, and we don't include in those figures generally the shipping and aviation, which is a really big part. And of course people like like Kevin Anderson would say we've actually hardly reduced our emissions at all, which is actually quite different to what Chris is saying and what the government is saying. So yeah, there's quite a bit of controversy over those figures. So I will press him on those when he comes back, if he comes back.
He's technically still in the meeting.
He is still there.
I'm here.
Chris, are you there? Hello.
Yeah, I'm here.
All right.
When did you lose me?
We did. We lost you for a minute. Right. Okay. So I was sort of just trying to hold the fort. Have we just about come to the end there, Chris? Do you want to go straight into questions?
Yes, I came to the end of what I was saying. Thank you.
Okay. Suddenly everything went pow. I was just saying, so basically we've had various questions submitted in advance, and there's been quite a lively chat while you've been talking, and I didn't want to keep interrupting you.
No.
I guess one of the things sort of bringing together some of the questions that have come through is really about the optimism of some of the figures you've given at the beginning about the cuts in greenhouse gas emissions for the UK, particularly, of course, the non-inclusion of shipping and aviation in those figures, the non-inclusion of biomass burning. We've moved most of our coal over to burning wood, and we don't count any of those emissions. The full life cycle analysis of gas and things like that. So I just wondered, how, we use these figures, everybody uses these figures, but they're not really that reliable. In fact, they're possibly very misleading. What do you think?
Right. Well, we have cut emissions from electricity generation. The point I was trying to make at the beginning is we haven't cut very much else. We have a lot remaining. And as you said, as Kevin Anderson pointed out, we are not including imports. That is to say, something bought in China incurs a carbon cost there. It requires coal electricity to make. We don't include that in our accounts. But the evidence is that has now peaked, and I would be more optimistic is the wrong word. I believe the evidence is that the UK's emissions are falling. They're not falling as fast as the government says they are, but we are making progress, except in transport, where we buy larger cars and are not electrifying fast enough. But in the last 6 months, we've seen a very rapid growth in electric car sales, and we are clearly beginning the cycle of complete replacement of in internal combustion engine cars. It needs to be encouraged. But I'm not, yes, the government figures are better than the underlying reality, but nevertheless, in many areas, we're not making much progress. In some areas, we are making significant progress, would be my contention.
Okay. Again, just a question that was submitted beforehand from Simon Bourne, and again, sort of backed up by other people's questions, which was really about the timeline here. You know, we really do only have, according to the IPCC, about 8 years of carbon budget yet left before we hit 1.5. We're not making enough progress. You know, all these new technologies, do we have time? You know, because as rapid as developments are they rapid enough?
All right, so it would require, I'm not saying, by the way, I don't say this is going to happen. Clearly, if we just continue on the route we're traveling at the moment, we will not get to net zero. That's being pointed out repeatedly by the Committee on Climate Change. So there has to be a central government, a local authority, individual, wider society commitment to this and to make it happen. If the decision was made to introduce robust house insulation projects, as I say, street by street, area by area, village by village, town by town, we could make a very rapid difference within 10 years. We are now talking of banning non-electric cars by 2030. That means that sometime around 2045, there won't be any internal combustion engine cars left. That's required if we're going to get our emissions down as a society by roughly 7% a year, which is what we need to do to meet the 2050 target. Okay, it's not happened so far. We're not on the right track. All I'm trying to say in the book is if we want to do it, these are the routes we could use to do it. Whether we can develop the political consensus to do this is much more of an open question.
Yes, I mean, I note in your article, your Guardian article, you've written that, you know, only 1% of the government globally, the government's recovery funds are going towards green tech and green recovery. That's a failure, isn't it?
Yeah. No, it's not great. But on the other hand, if you look at Germany and if you look at France, you are seeing recovery budgets of many tens of billions, of the order of a third of which is going to go into climate neutrality. France, for example, is focused on two particular things: building improvement. It's said we're going to insulate every public building, which I think would really improve the thermal characteristics of every single public building. It's also putting money into putting more freight onto the rail and improving local rail services. And the second major area is agriculture. It's trying to relocalize French agriculture so that it can be built around low carbon, organic, low pesticide use foundations. Nothing like that here yet. We just have to continue pushing for it.
Well, okay, so just following on from that, we've got a question from Myla Watts, really just asking about how do we get our government to listen? You know, what do we need to do? You know, there's a big emphasis, and I know in your book there's a big emphasis on individual action and individual, you know, curbing our consumption. How do we get government to listen?
We, you know, in the United States, climate action continues unabated, even with a president that is utterly unconvinced by the threat from global warming. And it's being pushed by companies and it's being pushed by local authorities, states and cities. The same thing is happening here. We're not going to get, in all probability, this central government to do very much. Local authorities obviously have constrained budgets. They have areas which they cannot actually move into. Companies also have some restrictions placed upon them. But as a society, we can do quite a lot without actually needing local central government to do very much. But it would be a lot easier if, for example, the government decided that a carbon tax was a good idea. And there are, of course, rumours that that will happen. There are rumours that hydrogen will become a central plank of this government's energy policy, and we'll believe it when we see it. But a lot of the most important actions can take place at local levels and through putting pressure on companies to change their mode of operation.
Okay, so we have more power as individuals than perhaps we often think.
Well, as individuals, Nikki, no, I don't think so. I mean, the problem is that I wrote my first book on this area 12 years ago, 13 years ago. And I'd go out and give talks on how we all needed to stop flying, for example, which is for many people the most important source of emissions. And I felt I got nowhere in this, even in conversations with people who were broadly committed to the idea of climate change being a desperately important problem. It was very difficult to get individuals to change, and that is beginning to alter. But more important, those that did change isolated themselves from the rest of society. They just became eco-activists who didn't talk to anybody. We need to bring everybody into this. And if we as individuals take action, that's important. We need to be beacons for everybody else. But we also need to operate within the wider society to influence the way that others act. And we don't just, if we just withdraw and say, I'm going to live in a yurt in the forest, where my emissions might be zero, but nevertheless, it is not solving the problem. We all need to be activists.
Okay, all right. Okay, so moving on, I've got a question here from Alex Hart.
Nikki, you sound so you disagree with that. Please.
I guess I do actually, because I feel the no-fly movement has now actually reached quite a critical point, and actually I don't feel that for those of us, and I'm sure there are many in this chat who have decided not to fly, I think actually we feel well supported by each other, and we don't feel like we're heading to a mountain in a yurt. We actually feel like we're making a significant change, that actually the industry is having to listen to us.
Yeah. You know, I was talking about 12 years ago, and it's clearly better now. But I think standing up in the centre of the room and saying, I've decided not to fly is the way forward, rather than just going to live in the commune, is the point I'm trying to make. And you're doing that. I'm not suggesting it's not important. I'm just saying that we live in a society, we've got to, our actions are only important insofar as they persuade other people.
But I think, just to pursue the point, it does seem to me that particularly in food and in aviation and so on, we have the chance, particularly with food and energy, to change the economics. You know, we're confusing the investment picture with our changing consumption patterns, and that's of course been exacerbated by COVID. So you know, it actually is having an effect, I think. But anyway, let's go on to some other questions. So Alex. Hartley wanted to ask particularly about community energy, which obviously you've addressed to an extent, and she's asked particularly about what you think needs to happen in the UK, and what one thing could everyone attending this event do to support community energy? Is there
one thing, right? Well, I saw Sophie Fernley-Whittingstall come into this meeting, and I did want to briefly mention what a project that she's involved with. She's one of the people supporting Abundance Generation, which has done a truly innovative thing, which is to begin to fundraise, crowdsource for community solar, local authority solar, raising money for local authorities, West Berkshire and Warrington, to put more solar on domestic buildings. Very small returns, but very low risk. And that's an example of the sort of thing that we can do, getting involved in investment opportunities. Now, there's lots of people in Bristol who are already involved in that. Obviously, it's the absolute centre for this. But I think we can all do more by pushing our savings towards those activities which are clearly carbon negative, including the development of renewable energy.
Okay, I've just got a question from Nicola on the role of biogas. I think that's something that you didn't particularly address.
Yeah. So shall we just briefly say what we're talking about here? If we grow plants and cut them down and put them into an airtight atmosphere, zero oxygen atmosphere, they will gradually rot. It's called anaerobic digestion. There are anaerobic digesters, large circular things all around the country now. And what comes out is a mixture of methane and carbon dioxide. That's called biogas. We can take the carbon dioxide away and preferably store it, and then burn the methane as an alternative to natural gas. Methane is the principal component of natural gas. The problem is, there are two problems here. One, we don't have that much spare organic material which we can digest in that way. We might be looking at perhaps 10% of total gas supply going down that route. And the worry is that we're tending to use foods such as corn, maize, in those digesters rather than true wastes. So there's a second issue there. So yes, in principle, this can be a very important means of complementing variable renewable sources, but the problem is the scale. Can we do it at a large enough scale to really make a difference? There are those people who say we can if we grow intelligently, but I'm not convinced of that yet.
I guess one source of biogas that we don't use well is sewage, in fact. So that it's my understanding that most of our sewage plants are not geared up for methane capture. I
thought they were by volume, Nikki. I may be out of date there or got the wrong numbers, but okay. They certainly were going to be.
Okay. Okay.
But remember, you know, just to give an illustration of the scale here. I don't want to go into too much biological detail, but we eat around 2 kilowatt hours of energy a day in the form of calories. The rest of our life is roughly 80 kilowatt hours a day. So even if all the energy we use ends up in sewage, which indirectly it pretty much does, we've only got a small fraction of our total energy needs.
Okay, all right. I'm just conscious of the time. It's about 10 to 9 now. I suggest that I'm going to put questions to you till just close to 9 o'clock. So just another couple of questions, and then we'll have to close for the evening. So I'm afraid we're not going to get to everyone. I have a question here from Fritjof about where you see the role of tidal power in the UK. Have you thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's two types of tidal energy, as probably people know. There's current, that is to say, capturing the speed of the water passing as the tide changes, and the other one is the capturing the rise in the tide and the fall in the tide. The one that's most relevant to the Bristol area, of course, is the lagoon idea, or the Severn barrage, which has broadly speaking been dropped. The lagoon idea for Swansea has, I thought, was absolutely fantastic. The government decided the economics weren't right. And indeed, it isn't expensive. The first few plants will be very expensive, but we have pretty much the best tidal range in the world here. And I think we ought to invest in it personally, even if it were going to cost several £100 million of subsidy in one way or another. Tidal stream, capturing the current, is more problematic. We've got, once again, we're very well endowed with this. We've got the fastest currents in the world, pretty much, off the north coast of Scotland, between Scotland and Orkney. It's bloody expensive. It's being exploited on a small scale now by the Maygen project. It's bloody expensive. I would like to see it. I'd like to see evidence it's going to get much cheaper. I'm not convinced yet.
Okay.
Whereas offshore wind is getting cheaper every day.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, there's that does lead on to a question from Sophie about how renewables are really going to affect costs for customers, power costs.
Well, the International Energy Agency said yesterday that this is not specific to the UK, of course, but it said solar is now the cheapest source of electricity the world has ever seen. You don't get comments like that often from the International Energy Agency, which is frankly a tool of the fossil fuel business. But government data in the UK is now showing that solar and wind, onshore and onshore, are cheaper than any other single source of electricity in the UK. If you are skeptical about renewables, you say, yes, but there's a huge cost to balancing them, to making sure that you've got the capacity to provide electricity when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. And to some extent, that's true. But government numbers, you can question them, but government numbers now unequivocally show that renewables are cheaper than gas with carbon capture and storage. Therefore, renewables will produce lower electricity bills than if we stayed with fossil fuels, assuming that we decided that we would capture the CO2 from those fossil fuels. But even without CO2 capture, offshore wind is now competitive with gas.
Okay, all right. I think we've probably got time for just one more question. There's one from Hannah here about tencel. Does it cause deforestation? And I guess onwards from that, are there other environmental?
Okay. Yes. Yeah,
negative...
tencel. The issue involved with viscose is always, is this resulting in Indonesian deforestation? So you need to buy your tencel from the main manufacturer of cellulose Lenzing in Austria, which has the most rigorous, really impressive source testing. So we all need to be more intelligent consumers, more actively looking at where our stuff comes from, whether it's electronics or clothing or food. And there's a good example of it. It's no good just saying cellulose is the right solution for clothing. We have to be sure that it's coming through a sustainable supply chain.
Okay, actually, maybe I'm told we've got time for a couple more. David Saunders asks, are aerogels for insulation a good option?
Yeah, I think so. It's very difficult to say one thing works in insulation. Insulation is a deeply idiosyncratic problem, but depending on the details, I would think that that's well worth looking at, yes.
Yeah, okay. Christopher's asked about the greenhouse gases of pellet boilers. Any thoughts on those?
Well, if you look at, to my right is a pellet boiler, which provides our heating up. Here we are currently high up in Snowdonia, and we certainly can't get heating through gas networks. In a house where a heat pump wouldn't easily be possible, I should say. A heat pump would be best. Right, greenhouse gas emissions from pellet boiler. They burn cleanly. Pellets have results properly burnt. Pellets result in very little else but CO2 going up the chimney. The CO2 from the pellets has, in my view, been collected by the wood. If you believe that woodlands cultivated for pellet production are carbon neutral, and I have to say, I believe they are. I think you differ from me on that, Nikki. I believe they are. In that case, the CO2 going up the chimney is equivalent to the CO2 captured by the tree. That is, I realize there is a deep illustration of an ideological viewpoint, and I realize that probably most people in the room today won't agree with me on that. I do understand that. I believe that wood can be a zero carbon fuel.
I guess the point I would say is that that's not an ideological issue. It's a very practical issue. Just because trees soaked up carbon in the past, if we then burn them, and after centuries of growing or tens of years of growing, we put that carbon up a chimney within minutes, that's very hard to see how that's going to be carbon neutral from this point. So, and I guess, of course, what many people will be aware of is that our biomass industry is sucking in imports from forests, particularly in North America, where they are being clear felled. This isn't
absolutely. Although, if you go and talk to most of these pellets are being burnt at the power station Drax in North Yorkshire, although they're being built elsewhere as well. And Drax has looked at this and is convinced that what it's doing is okay. Other people may take different views on this. One of my proposals, sorry, Nikki.
I think people should look at Biofuel Watch and actually hear what people in North America are saying about the taking down of their forests for electricity production in Europe, and UK being the leading use of this.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's yes, a lot of it's coming into the UK. So I have, if I may say so, profound differences with Biofuel Watch. I think its tactics are inappropriate, and I would not hesitate to say that if there was someone from Biofuel Watch in the room. But I do understand this point. The world needs to be conscious that wood pellet production can result in deforestation. In my opinion, it generally does not, but nevertheless, I'm not arguing for complacency over this.
Okay, all right. Well, I think we are at 3 minutes to 9, so I think we probably should draw it to an end there. But thank you so much, Chris, for your input and for being with us here this evening. As I say, anybody who wants to get a copy of Chris's book can slip him 10 quid through his and order it through his carbon commentary website. And yeah, I mean, I wish we could give you a round of applause, Chris, but we can't. So it's a virtual round of applause.
That's
and
very, very kind of you. Thank you
very much for your support for Avon Needs Trees. Yeah, absolutely.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks very much indeed, Nikki.
And thank you to everybody else for coming and for supporting us. And I'm sorry we didn't get to all questions. I'm very happy if you write to me separately to answer some of the small questions that I may be able to help with, or I guess I can forward them to Chris and he'll put them in his carbon commentary sometime in the near future. But again, thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at Hazeland. And please don't forget our crowdfunder for Seed, and yeah, look out for more Avon Needs Trees events in the future. Thank you very much.